I never believed in ghosts. I mean, I've always enjoyed a good horror movie, maybe read a spooky book or two, but when it came to real-life hauntings, I was skeptical, until that winter. It was December, around the holidays, when I experienced something that changed my entire perspective on the supernatural. I'm not telling you this to scare you, although if you're still listening by the end, you'll probably be more than just a little creeped out. But to tell you what really happened to me one bitterly cold night in the middle of nowhere. It all started when I was invited to a Christmas gathering in upstate New York, deep in the Adirondack Mountains. The cabin belonged to my friend James. He'd recently inherited it from his great-uncle, an old recluse who'd lived there his entire life. The cabin was old, like really old, built in the 1800s. James was excited about showing us the place, but he warned us that the roads could get pretty rough with all the snow. Still, a winter cabin getaway sounded like the perfect escape from the holiday chaos, so I figured, why not? The drive up was uneventful, but the temperature dropped dramatically the closer we got. By the time we arrived, the sky had turned a deep gray, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. The cabin stood at the end of a long, narrow road that cut through the thick forest. It was picturesque, in a way, if you ignored how isolated it was. The place looked like something out of an old postcard, with its wooden beams and stone chimney. But as I got closer, I felt something off. I shrugged it off, blaming the cold and the ominous clouds that threatened snow. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a roaring fire already going. The place smelled of pine and burning wood. My friends were already there, laughing, drinking hot cocoa, and enjoying the warmth. I quickly forgot about the strange feeling I'd had outside, at least for a while. As the night wore on, we settled in for a relaxing evening. The snow had begun falling heavily outside, blanketing everything in white. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered a couple of times before cutting out completely. We weren't too worried. This was the Adirondacks in the middle of winter, after all. James lit a few oil lamps he'd found in the basement, and we continued chatting by the fireplace. It was probably around midnight when things started to get weird. We'd been swapping stories, mostly harmless tales of bad dates and awkward family holidays, when James brought up his great-uncle. He told us how the old man had lived in the cabin alone for nearly 50 years. He had never married, never had kids, and rarely spoke to anyone in the nearby town. Apparently, the locals considered him a bit of an oddball. There were rumors that he was into some dark stuff, but James laughed it off, saying they were just the product of small-town gossip. Still, the mood in the room shifted after that. The wind outside had picked up, and it sounded like something was scraping against the windows. We tried to ignore it, but the eerie noise persisted. After a few minutes, Sarah, one of the girls who'd come with, asked if anyone else could hear whispering. We all went silent, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. But then I heard it. Faint, almost too quiet to notice, but definitely there. It sounded like voices, but they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the cabin. We all exchanged uneasy glances, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, or the fire, or even our imaginations playing tricks on us. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They didn't sound angry or malicious, just present. Like someone or something was trying to communicate with us. James, being the skeptic he is, suggested we all go to bed and call it a night. He figured a good night's sleep would put an end to our nerves. But sleep didn't come easily. I stayed in one of the upstairs rooms, huddled under layers of blankets as the temperature continued to drop. The whispers hadn't stopped, though they were now quieter, more like a constant murmur in the background. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were soft, deliberate, and definitely not the wind. I called out, thinking maybe one of the others was up, but no one answered. The footsteps continued, slowly making their way toward my door. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in me told me to stay in bed, not to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight on the nightstand and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps, they didn't stop. They moved down the stairs, creaking with each step. I followed, shining the flashlight ahead of me. The cabin was silent, except for those steady, unnerving footfalls. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the steps stopped abruptly. I stood frozen in place, shining the light around the living room. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was a figure standing by the window. It was just a silhouette, backlit by the dim glow of the snow-covered landscape outside. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, a long coat, boots, and a hat, like something out of the 19th century. I could only see its outline, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it was looking right at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel a cold sweat break out across my skin. Then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared. Right through the wall. No door, no sound. It was just gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no logic, no explanation that made any sense. Finally, I stumbled back to my room, locked the door, and sat awake until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. The next morning, I told James and the others what I'd seen. I expected them to laugh it off, to tell me I was imagining things. But when I finished, everyone was dead silent. James finally spoke up and said he'd seen something similar the first time he'd stayed at the cabin alone. He hadn't wanted to mention it, thinking he'd sound crazy. We packed up and left that afternoon, cutting our trip short. None of us spoke much on the drive back, but I knew none of us would ever forget that night. I never went back to the cabin, and as far as I know, neither did James. We stopped talking about it after a while, like somehow ignoring it would make it go away. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the world feels too quiet. And every time, I'm reminded of that figure standing by the window, watching, waiting, never truly gone.